The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, cream-colored cardstock with gold foil lettering that caught the light as I pulled it from the mailbox. My sister Natalie's wedding invitation. I ran my fingers over the embossed names, feeling the weight of expensive paper stock, the kind that whispers exclusivity before you even read the words inside. I was happy for her. Truly. She had found Brandon Whitmore, a man whose family name carried weight in Portland's business circles, and their engagement had been the talk of our family for months. I opened the envelope carefully, expecting to see the usual +3 notation that would include my husband Daniel and our 2 children, Sophie and Lucas. So before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Instead, I found a single line beneath my name. Victoria Hayes. Just my name. No guest allowance. No acknowledgement that I had a family of my own. I read it 3 times, thinking perhaps I had misunderstood, that maybe children's invitations came separately. Then I saw the note card tucked behind the main invitation, handwritten in my mother's precise script. Victoria, we've decided to keep the wedding adults only. It will be more elegant that way. We knew you'd understand. Arrangements have been made for an adults-only celebration. Your children can stay with Daniel's parents that weekend. Looking forward to seeing you there. Mom. My hands went still. The paper suddenly felt heavier than it had moments before. Adults only. As if my 8-year-old daughter and 6-year-old son were disruptions to be managed rather than family to be celebrated. I stood in my kitchen, sunlight streaming through the windows onto the countertop where my children's drawings were held by magnets on the refrigerator. Sophie had just made one for Aunt Natalie last week, a crayon drawing of the 2 of them holding hands with hearts floating above their heads. Lucas had been practicing writing his name so he could sign the card himself. They had been so excited when I told them about the wedding, asking what they would wear, whether there would be cake, if they could dance with the flower girl. I called my mother that evening after the kids were in bed. I kept my voice steady, reasonable. Mom, I got the invitation. I noticed it doesn't include Sophie and Lucas. There must have been a mistake with the printing. She didn't hesitate. There's no mistake, Victoria. Natalie wants a sophisticated affair. You know how these high society weddings are. Children running around would ruin the aesthetic. The Whitmores are spending a fortune. We can't have the ceremony disrupted by crying or restlessness. I felt something shift in my chest, a familiar sensation I had spent years trying to ignore. But they're family, I said quietly. They're her niece and nephew. She sighed, the kind of sigh that said I was being difficult, that I was failing to see reason. Victoria, don't make this harder than it needs to be. One day without your children won't hurt anyone. This is Natalie's special day. Surely you can put her needs first just this once. Just this once. The phrase hung in the air between us, bitter and familiar. Because it was never just once. It had been a lifetime of putting Natalie first, of being told my needs were secondary, my feelings overly sensitive, my presence conditional on how little space I took up. I told my mother I needed to think about it and ended the call. Daniel found me sitting on the porch steps, staring at nothing. He sat beside me without speaking, waiting. When I finally told him what had happened, his jaw tightened. That's ridiculous, he said. They're kids. They're part of this family. Why would anyone ban children from a family wedding? I didn't have an answer that didn't sound like an accusation. Because Natalie always gets what she wants. Because my parents have never said no to her. Because in this family, there has always been a hierarchy, and I have never been at the top of it. The next morning, I woke to a group text from my mother. It had been sent to the family thread, the one that included my parents, Natalie, my Aunt Linda, my Uncle Thomas, and my cousin Michelle. The message read, just a reminder that Natalie's wedding will be an adult event. We appreciate everyone's understanding and cooperation in keeping the day elegant and uninterrupted. There were immediate responses. Aunt Linda sent a thumbs-up emoji. Uncle Thomas replied, sounds perfect. Cousin Michelle wrote, can't wait. So classy. No one questioned it. No one asked why. No one seemed to think it was strange that two children who had been part of every family gathering, every holiday, every celebration, were suddenly deemed unworthy of attendance. I stared at my phone, reading the thread over and over, waiting for someone to speak up. Waiting for someone to say this didn't feel right. The silence was deafening. I didn't respond to the text. Instead, I got Sophie and Lucas ready for school, packed their lunches, walked them to the bus stop, and went about my day as if the ground hadn't just shifted beneath me. But inside, something had changed. A door I had kept closed for years, a door I had convinced myself didn't need to be opened, had just been kicked wide open. That evening, Natalie called. I could hear the brightness in her voice, the kind of bright that comes from someone who has never had to fight for a seat at the table. "Hey Vic," she said, using the nickname only she was allowed to use. "I just wanted to make sure you got the invitation. Isn't it gorgeous? Brandon's mom helped design them. They cost a fortune, but they're perfect." I held the phone away from my ear for a moment, steadying myself. "I got it," I said. "I noticed Sophie and Lucas aren't invited." There was a pause, just a fraction of a second, before she responded. "Oh, that. Yeah, we decided to keep it child-free. It's going to be such a formal event, you know? The venue is all white and glass. We just can't risk anything getting damaged or disrupted. You understand, right?" I closed my eyes. "Do I have a choice?" I asked. She laughed, light and carefree. "Oh, Vic, don't be dramatic. It's one day. You'll have a great time without worrying about the kids. You can actually enjoy yourself for once." The words landed with precision. For once. As if my life with my children was a burden I needed relief from. As if their existence was something to be managed and minimized. I told her I had to go and hung up before she could say anything else. That night, I sat at my laptop, the house quiet around me. Daniel had taken the kids to his parents' house for the evening, giving me space I didn't ask for but desperately needed. I opened a folder on my desktop, one I hadn't looked at in months. Inside were documents, spreadsheets, contracts, and emails spanning the last 8 years. Evidence of a life my family knew nothing about. You see, while my parents had been pouring their attention and resources into Natalie's dreams, her business ventures, her social climbing, I had been building something entirely different. Something quiet. Something mine. I had learned a long time ago that visibility in this family came with conditions. So I had stopped seeking it. Instead, I became invisible. And in that invisibility, I became powerful. But before I tell you how I dismantled everything they thought they had built, before I show you what happens when you exclude the wrong person's children, I need you to understand how we got here. Because this story doesn't start with a wedding invitation. It starts decades earlier, in a house where one daughter was gilded and the other was tolerated. It starts with a pattern so deeply ingrained that no one even noticed it anymore. It starts with me learning that love in my family was a competition I was never meant to win. Growing up, I learned early that attention was currency in our household, and Natalie was born rich. She arrived 3 years before me, and by the time I came along, her position as the golden child had already been established. My earliest memories are of standing on the periphery of rooms where Natalie held court. She had a way of commanding space without effort, her laughter loud and infectious, her demands delivered with a smile that made them seem like invitations rather than expectations. My parents orbited around her like she was the sun, and I was expected to do the same. When Natalie wanted to take ballet, my parents enrolled her in the most prestigious dance academy in Portland, driving her across town 3 times a week, sitting through recitals, buying costumes that cost more than our monthly grocery bill. When I asked if I could take ballet too, my mother said we couldn't afford 2 sets of lessons. When I suggested maybe we could alternate years, she looked at me with something close to pity and said, "Sweetheart, Natalie has real talent. We need to nurture that." I was 7 years old when I stopped asking for things. Not because I didn't want them, but because I learned that wanting was something I was supposed to do quietly, privately, without expectation of fulfillment. Natalie's wants were reasonable, justified, worthy of sacrifice. Mine were burdensome. When I brought home straight A's from elementary school, my mother glanced at my report card and said, "That's nice, honey," before turning back to help Natalie with her C- math homework. When I won the regional spelling bee in 5th grade, my parents couldn't attend because it conflicted with Natalie's dance recital. My teacher drove me to the competition, sat in the audience, and cheered when I won. My parents asked how it went when I got home, already distracted by Natalie's tearful recount of a misstep in her routine that no one but her had noticed. I learned that my victories were expected, unremarkable, while Natalie's struggles were tragedies that required the full family's attention and intervention. In high school, the pattern deepened. Natalie dated the captain of the football team, went to homecoming and prom, had her photos plastered across my mother's social media with captions about her beautiful daughter and the magical moments of youth. I spent those same years in the library, building a GPA that would earn me a full academic scholarship to Portland State University. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When my acceptance letter arrived with the scholarship notification, my mother hugged me briefly and said, "I'm so glad you won't be a financial burden." When Natalie decided she wanted to attend the University of Oregon, a school she barely qualified for and that came with a tuition bill that made my father's jaw tighten, they took out loans. Because Natalie deserved the college experience. Because Natalie needed the opportunities. Because Natalie's dreams mattered in a way mine apparently didn't. I worked 3 part-time jobs through college. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in business administration and a minor in finance. I paid for every textbook, every meal plan, every bus pass. My parents came to my graduation, sat through the ceremony, took one photo, and left immediately after because Natalie had a dinner party they had promised to attend. I stood in my cap and gown, diploma in hand, watching them drive away, and I realized something that would shape the next decade of my life. I would never be enough for them. Not because I wasn't accomplished or capable or worthy, but because the role of beloved daughter had already been cast, and there was only room for one star in this production. So I stopped auditioning. I graduated and moved into a small apartment on the east side of Portland. I took a job at a consulting firm, entry-level work that paid barely enough to cover rent and groceries. My parents didn't ask about my life. They didn't visit my apartment. They called occasionally, usually when they needed something, a ride to the airport, help moving furniture, someone to watch the house while they took Natalie on a trip to celebrate her latest achievement. I met Daniel during my 2nd year out of college. He was a software engineer, quiet and steady, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. Our first date lasted 6 hours because neither of us wanted it to end. He didn't come from money or prestige. He came from a family that ate dinner together every night, that asked questions and remembered the answers, that celebrated each other without keeping score. When he met my parents for the first time, he noticed things I had stopped seeing. After dinner, as we drove home, he said, "They didn't ask you a single question about yourself." The entire meal was about Natalie's new job, Natalie's new apartment, Natalie's new boyfriend. "They don't even know what you do for work, do they?" I had shrugged, uncomfortable with his noticing. "That's just how they are." He had looked at me with something I wasn't used to, concern that wasn't conditional. "That's not normal, Victoria. You know that, right?" I married Daniel in a small ceremony at a botanical garden. 30 people attended, mostly his family and our friends. My parents came but left early. Natalie was my maid of honor, a role she accepted with the kind of gracious condescension that suggested she was doing me a favor. She spent the reception talking about her own future wedding, the one she would have someday when she found someone worthy of her. My mother listened with rapt attention, already planning an event that didn't exist while I danced with my new husband at my actual wedding. When Sophie was born 2 years later, I thought maybe things would change. Surely a grandchild would shift the dynamic, create new space for connection. My mother came to the hospital, held Sophie for exactly 10 minutes, took 3 photos, and left because she had plans with Natalie. My father never came at all. He was helping Natalie move into a new condo, one my parents had co-signed for because her credit wasn't good enough on her own. When Lucas was born 18 months after Sophie, my parents didn't come to the hospital. They sent a card and a small gift basket, the kind you buy at the grocery store checkout. Natalie visited once, held Lucas for a photo she posted on her social media with a caption about being the best aunt ever, and then didn't visit again for 6 months. My children grew up knowing their grandparents existed but not really knowing them. Patricia and Robert were names attached to people who appeared at mandatory holidays, who gave generic gifts clearly purchased last minute, who asked no questions about school or friends or interests. Meanwhile, my in-laws, Daniel's parents, became the functional grandparents. They babysat every Friday. They came to every school play and soccer game. They knew Sophie loved drawing and Lucas was obsessed with dinosaurs. They were present. My parents were not. And for years, I told myself it didn't matter. I had built a life separate from them, a good life with a husband who loved me and children who were thriving. I didn't need my parents' approval or attention. I had moved on. But moving on and healing are not the same thing. And when that wedding invitation arrived with my children's names conspicuously absent, when my mother's note casually dismissed their right to be included, something cracked open inside me. All those years of swallowing hurt, of rationalizing neglect, of convincing myself I was fine, shattered in an instant. Because this wasn't about me anymore. This was about Sophie and Lucas. This was about my parents looking at my children and deciding they were less important, less worthy, less valuable than the aesthetic of Natalie's perfect day. And that, I could not forgive. I sat at my computer that night, staring at those files, those documents that represented years of work my family knew nothing about, and I made a decision. If my parents wanted to exclude my children, if Natalie wanted her perfect adult-only celebration, if they all wanted to pretend my family didn't matter, then I would show them exactly what happens when you underestimate someone you've spent a lifetime dismissing. You see, while they were busy celebrating Natalie, I had been busy building an empire they didn't know existed. And that empire was about to become the most important thing in their world. Because the venue where Natalie was planning to get married, that beautiful glass and white estate on the river, the one that cost a fortune to book, the one that made her squeal with delight when Brandon proposed there, that venue didn't belong to the Whitmores. It belonged to a property investment group that had purchased it 3 years ago when it was on the verge of bankruptcy. A property investment group that I had founded. A property investment group that operated under a name so bland and unremarkable that no one had ever thought to look into who actually owned it. The Riverside estate was mine. And Natalie had no idea she was planning her dream wedding on a property I controlled. I didn't set out to become a real estate investor. It wasn't some grand plan I hatched in college or a childhood dream I nurtured. It happened by accident, the way most significant things in life do, through a combination of necessity, opportunity, and spite. After Daniel and I got married, we lived in a cramped apartment in southeast Portland where the walls were so thin we could hear our neighbors' conversations word for word. I was working at the consulting firm, doing market analysis for clients who rarely remembered my name, and Daniel was debugging software for a startup that paid him an equity that would probably never materialize. We were broke in that specific way young couples are broke, where you're not starving but you're definitely eating pasta 4 nights a week and considering whether you really need Netflix or if you can just borrow someone's login. My parents never offered to help. When Natalie needed money for rent, they sent it immediately. When she wanted to take a trip to Europe to find herself, they funded it without question. When her car broke down, they bought her a new one. But when Daniel and I struggled to make rent after an unexpected medical bill, when I called my father and asked if we could borrow $1,000 just until my next paycheck, he had sighed heavily and said he would think about it. He never called back. Natalie got a check for $5,000 that same month for her birthday. I stopped asking for help after that. Not because I was too proud, though pride played a part, but because I finally understood that in my parents' eyes, my struggles were character building while Natalie's were tragedies. I was supposed to figure things out on my own. So I did. The consulting firm I worked for specialized in helping businesses optimize their operations, cut costs, improve efficiency. I was good at it. Really good. I could look at a company's financials and see patterns others missed, identify waste, spot opportunities for growth. My analyses saved clients hundreds of thousands of dollars. My boss loved me because I made him look brilliant. He would take my reports into client meetings, present my findings as his own insights, and collect bonuses while I got a standard annual raise that barely kept pace with inflation. It was my parents' dynamic recreated in professional form. I was the engine, someone else was the face, and I was expected to be grateful for the opportunity to contribute. But I started keeping copies of everything I did. Every analysis, every recommendation, every strategy one developed. I built a portfolio of my own work, documented with timestamps and email trails that proved my authorship. And I started taking clients on the side. Small businesses that couldn't afford the consulting firm's rates but desperately needed help. A coffee shop owner who was 3 months from closing. A family-run bookstore being crushed by online retailers. A small property management company that was hemorrhaging money through inefficient systems. I met with them after hours and on weekends, charged rates I could afford to charge because I wasn't supporting a downtown office and a staff of 20, and I fixed their problems. The coffee shop owner restructured her supplier contracts based on my recommendations and was profitable within 6 months. The bookstore pivoted to hosting events and creating a community space, becoming a neighborhood anchor instead of just a retail location. The property management company, that one was interesting. His name was Gerald, and he was 72 years old, tired, and ready to retire. He owned 4 small apartment buildings in North Portland, decent properties in neighborhoods that were just starting to show signs of gentrification. He was losing money because he was too trusting, too kind, too willing to let things slide. Tenants paid late, repairs went unaddressed, and his bookkeeping was a disaster. I spent 3 months helping him organize his operations, implement systems, train a part-time manager. By the end of it, his properties were running smoothly and turning a profit. He was so grateful he offered me a deal. He wanted to sell and retire to Arizona where his daughter lived. But he didn't want to sell to a big developer who would get the buildings and triple the rents. He wanted someone who would take care of his tenants, people who had lived there for years and deserved stability. He offered to sell me the buildings at below market value if I promised to keep them affordable and maintain them properly. I had no money. Daniel and I had maybe $8,000 in savings. The buildings were worth over $1 million even at Gerald's discounted price. It was impossible. Except I couldn't stop thinking about it. I spent a week running numbers, modeling scenarios, researching financing options. I called every bank, every credit union, every alternative lender I could find. Most laughed at me. A 26-year-old woman with no real estate experience and no money wanted to buy 4 apartment buildings. It was absurd. But I kept trying because something in me refused to accept that opportunity was only for people who already had resources. I finally found a small community bank willing to take a chance. The loan officer was a woman named Carla who had spent her career fighting to get loans approved for people the big banks ignored. She looked at my business plan, the one I had stayed up for 3 nights straight creating, and she saw what I saw. Not risk, but potential. She approved the loan with conditions. I needed to put down 10%, which meant I needed $100,000 I didn't have. I needed co-signers. I needed proof of income. I needed a miracle. I called my parents one more time. I explained the opportunity, the numbers, the potential. I asked if they would co-sign, told them they wouldn't have to put up any money, just their signatures and their credit. My father had listened in silence and then said no. He said real estate was too risky. He said I was being impulsive. He said I should focus on my job and let professionals handle investments. Then he had asked if I had talked to Natalie lately because she was going through a hard time after a breakup and could use her big sister's support. I hung up and cried for an hour. Then I called Daniel's parents. Martin and Joyce had been public school teachers their entire careers. They lived in a modest house in Gresham, drove cars they had owned for over a decade, and took one vacation a year to visit family in Montana. They didn't have money to spare. But when I explained the situation, when I showed them my business plan and my projections, when I told them about Gerald and his tenants and the opportunity to do something good while building something sustainable, they didn't hesitate. They refinanced their house. They took out a home equity line of credit. They gave me the $100,000 I needed, not as a loan but as an investment. They became my first partners. We formed an LLC, Harris Properties, named after Daniel's grandmother. I signed the papers to buy Gerald's buildings on a Friday afternoon in March. I was terrified and exhilarated and more certain than I had ever been that I was doing exactly what I was meant to do. The first year was brutal. I managed the properties myself while still working full-time at the consulting firm. I learned how to fix leaky faucets and unclog drains. I negotiated with contractors and chased down unpaid rent. I showed up at 2 in the morning when a pipe burst and at 6 in the morning when a tenant locked themselves out. Daniel helped when he could, but he was working long hours trying to get his startup off the ground. My in-laws helped too, Martin handling lawn care and Joyce organizing a tenant appreciation day that built goodwill and community. My own parents never asked how it was going. They didn't know I had bought the buildings. I never told them. What was the point? They had made it clear that my ambitions were not worth their support. But the properties stabilized. Tenants stayed because I treated them with respect, kept my promises, and maintained the buildings properly. Word spread in the neighborhood that I was a good landlord, a rarity in a city where rent was skyrocketing and displaced families were common. I started getting calls from other small property owners, people like Gerald who wanted to sell to someone who wouldn't destroy what they had built. Within 3 years, I owned 12 buildings. Within 5 years, I had 20. I quit the consulting firm when my real estate income surpassed my salary. My boss was shocked. He offered me a raise, a promotion, a corner office. I declined all of it and walked out with my portfolio of work and a list of contacts who would become my private consulting clients. Sophie was a toddler by then, and I was pregnant with Lucas. I worked from home, managing properties through a combination of good systems and a small staff of people I trusted. I hired a property manager named Helen who had been struggling to find work after leaving an abusive relationship. I hired a maintenance supervisor named Marcus who had aged out of foster care and was trying to build a life with no family support. I hired people who needed chances, who understood what it meant to be overlooked, and I paid them well and treated them with dignity. They were loyal in ways that went beyond employment. They believed in what we were building because they were part of building it. My parents still knew nothing. They never asked about my work, never inquired about how we afforded our house or how we paid our bills. They assumed Daniel's tech job covered everything, or they simply didn't care enough to wonder. Natalie certainly never asked. She was too busy with her own life, bouncing between jobs she quit when they became boring, dating men who funded her lifestyle, cultivating an image of effortless glamour on social media while my parents subsidized the reality behind the filters. And I let them remain ignorant because their ignorance gave me freedom. They couldn't criticize what they didn't know about. They couldn't minimize achievements they didn't know existed. I operated in a realm completely separate from their awareness, and that separation became my greatest advantage. Then the Riverside Estate opportunity appeared. It was 8 years after I bought my first buildings. By then, my portfolio included residential properties, a few small commercial spaces, and a partnership in a development project that was turning an abandoned warehouse into live-work lofts for artists. I had learned to spot potential where others saw only problems. The Riverside Estate was definitely a problem. It had been built 15 years earlier by a wealthy couple who envisioned it as Portland's premier wedding and event venue. The location was stunning, right on the Willamette River with views of the water and the city skyline. The architecture was modern and elegant, all glass walls and clean lines, with gardens that cascaded down to a private dock. It should have been successful. Instead, it was a money pit. The owners had no business sense. They booked events at rates that didn't cover their costs. They failed to maintain the property, and deferred maintenance turned into expensive emergency repairs. They hired unreliable staff and developed a reputation for events that looked beautiful in photos but were disasters in execution. Brides complained about missing deliveries, broken promises, and vendors who showed up late or not at all. The reviews were scathing. Within 5 years, bookings dropped to almost nothing. The owners took out loans to keep operating, then took out more loans to pay the first loans. By year 10, they were drowning. By year 12, the bank foreclosed. The property sat empty for 2 years. The bank tried to sell it but couldn't find a buyer willing to take on the amount of work it needed. The price dropped and dropped again. I watched it happen from a distance, tracking the listings, studying the financials that were public record due to the foreclosure. I saw what everyone else saw, a disaster. But I also saw something else. Potential. Because the problems were all operational, not structural. The bones of the venue were excellent. The location was irreplaceable. What it needed was someone who understood systems, who knew how to build reliable operations, who had connections to good contractors and vendors. Someone like me. I put together an investment group. Helen, my property manager, had been saving aggressively and wanted to invest in something bigger than residential rentals. Marcus had family money he had never touched, an inheritance from a grandmother who believed in him when no one else did. Priya, a tech entrepreneur I had met through consulting work, was looking to diversify her portfolio. Julian, who ran the most successful event planning company in Portland, wanted a venue he could control and elevate. We pooled resources and made an offer so low it was almost insulting. The bank, desperate to get the property off their books, accepted. We spent 6 months renovating. Not a gut renovation, we didn't have that kind of capital, but a smart one. We fixed everything that was broken, updated everything that was dated, and created systems that would prevent the chaos that had plagued the previous owners. Julian brought in his team to manage bookings and coordinate events. Helen handled the operational logistics. Marcus supervised maintenance and facilities. Priya built a technology infrastructure that streamlined everything from scheduling to payments. I oversaw the finances and the overall strategy. We reopened the Riverside estate 18 months after purchasing it, with a marketing campaign that emphasized reliability, beauty, and flawless execution. We were booked solid within 3 months. That was 3 years ago. Since then, the Riverside estate had become one of the most sought-after venues in Portland. We hosted weddings every weekend from April through October, corporate events during the week, and private parties that ranged from intimate gatherings to galas for 300 people. We were profitable, respected, and entirely under the radar of my family's awareness. They had no idea I was part owner of anything, let alone one of Portland's premier event venues. Why would they? They never asked what I did. They never expressed interest in my life beyond the superficial pleasantries required at holiday gatherings. And so when Natalie got engaged to Brandon Whitmore and began planning her wedding, when she gushed to my mother about the venue she had found, the one that was absolutely perfect and so exclusive they were lucky to get a booking, I had listened with a careful expression of polite interest and said nothing. I knew the moment she mentioned the name. The Riverside Estate. She had shown me photos on her phone, pointing out the glass walls and the river views, the gardens where she would have her ceremony, the ballroom where they would have dinner and dancing. She had no idea that when she submitted her deposit and signed her contract, that money went into an account I managed. She had no idea that when she met with the event coordinator to discuss details, that coordinator reported to Julian, who reported to me. She had no idea that every element of her perfect wedding was being orchestrated by the sister she had spent a lifetime overshadowing. And I had said nothing because I was waiting. Waiting to see if this family could surprise me. Waiting to see if, just once, they might choose differently. The adults-only wedding invitation was my answer. They chose exactly as they always had. Natalie's desires over my children's inclusion. Aesthetics over family. Image over substance. And in making that choice, they handed me something more valuable than they could possibly understand. They gave me certainty. Certainty that I owed them nothing. Certainty that protecting my children from their conditional love was not cruelty but mercy. Certainty that what I was about to do was not revenge but boundaries. Because I had spent 35 years trying to earn a place in this family. I had been the good daughter, the uncomplaining sister, the one who showed up and smiled and swallowed hurt. And it had never been enough. It would never be enough. So I stopped trying to be enough for them and started being everything for myself. The wedding was scheduled for June 15th, 4 months away. Natalie had been planning for over a year. Ever since Brandon proposed on the venue's dock at sunset in a moment, she had posted across every social media platform with professional photos and a caption about fairy tales coming true. The Whitmores were footing most of the bill, a fact my mother mentioned constantly with poorly concealed pride. Brandon's family had money, real money, the kind that came from generations of careful investments and strategic marriages. They owned a chain of luxury car dealerships across the Pacific Northwest and had diversified into real estate development and private equity. Gregory Whitmore, Brandon's father, was the kind of man who wore custom suits and played golf at country clubs that didn't advertise membership. Diane Whitmore, his mother, sat on the boards of 3 nonprofit organizations and hosted fundraisers where tickets cost $1,000 a plate. Natalie had been trying to marry into wealth her entire adult life. She dated men based on their potential net worth, cultivated friendships with women who had trust funds, and crafted an image of sophistication that was all surface and no substance. Brandon was her crowning achievement, proof that she belonged in circles most people only read about. And my parents were thrilled. They talked about the Whitmores constantly, dropping their name into conversations like it elevated our family by association. My mother had already bought 3 new outfits for various wedding-related events. My father had gotten a new suit tailored. They were preparing to bask in reflected glory, to be the parents of the bride who married well, who secured her future, who did everything right. I let them plan. I let Natalie send her updates in the family group chat, photos of dress fittings and flower arrangements and cake tastings. I let my mother coordinate shower invitations and rehearsal dinner details. I watched it all unfold with the detachment of someone observing a play they had already read. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew that the venue contract Natalie had signed included a standard cancellation clause. Any cancellation made less than 90 days before the event date resulted in forfeiture of the entire deposit and liability for 50% of the remaining balance. Natalie's deposit had been $15,000. The total cost of her wedding package was $80,000. If her wedding was cancelled with less than 90 days' notice, she would lose $15,000 and owe $40,000 more. $55,000. Gone. And the contract also included a clause that gave the venue the right to cancel for any reason with 60 days' notice, with a full refund of deposits but no liability for additional costs or damages. It was a protection clause, standard in the industry, designed to give venues an out if a client became abusive to staff, if they violated terms of service, if circumstances made the event untenable. I had written that clause myself when we drafted our contracts. I had never imagined I would use it. Until now. The weeks following the invitation felt surreal, like watching a storm build on the horizon while everyone around me commented on how beautiful the clouds looked. Natalie sent daily updates to the family group chat. She had found the perfect photographer, one who had shot weddings for minor celebrities and charged accordingly. She had chosen a florist who specialized in installations that looked like they belonged in museum galleries. She had hired a string quartet that performed at the symphony. Every detail was curated for maximum impact, every choice designed to communicate wealth and taste and belonging. My mother responded to each update with enthusiastic emojis and exclamation points. My father chimed in occasionally with brief affirmations. Aunt Linda asked questions about color palettes and guest counts. Uncle Thomas made jokes about open bars and dance floor disasters. Cousin Michelle volunteered to help with decorations and setup. The thread hummed with collective excitement, a family united in celebration of Natalie's achievement. I watched in silence, my name appearing in the recipient list but my voice conspicuously absent. No one noticed. Or if they did, they didn't care enough to ask why. Daniel noticed. He would glance at my phone when notifications lit up the screen, see me read the messages and set the phone down without responding. One evening, about 3 weeks after the invitation arrived, he found me sitting on the back porch with a glass of wine, staring at nothing. He sat beside me and waited, a skill he had perfected over the years of marriage. He knew I would talk when I was ready, that pushing only made me retreat further. After several minutes of silence broken only by the sound of wind through the trees and distant traffic, I finally spoke. "I need to tell you something," I said. "And I need you to hear all of it before you respond." Over the next hour, I told him everything. Not just about the wedding invitation and the exclusion of our children, he already knew that part, but about the business side of things. About Harris Properties and the investment group and the Riverside estate. He knew I owned rental properties, but he didn't know the full scope of what I had built. I had kept it compartmentalized, not out of secrecy exactly, but out of a desire to have something that was entirely mine, something I didn't have to explain or justify or defend. As I talked, walking him through the timeline of acquisitions and partnerships and growth, his expression shifted from surprise to something approaching awe. When I finished by explaining that Natalie's dream venue was actually my venue, that her perfect wedding was being planned on property I owned, he sat back and let out a long breath. "How did I not know about this?" he asked, not accusatory but genuinely curious. "You know about Harris Properties," I said. "You've met Helen and Marcus. You've seen the financial statements when we file taxes." He shook his head. "I knew you owned rental properties. I didn't know you owned 20 buildings. I didn't know you owned the Riverside estate. I didn't know you were," he paused, searching for words, "I didn't know you were running an empire." I smiled, a small tight smile that didn't reach my eyes. "It's not an empire," I said. "It's just good decisions compounded over time." He reached for my hand. "Victoria, this is extraordinary. Why didn't you tell me the full extent of it?" I had thought about that question myself many times. The answer was complicated, layered with old wounds and learned behaviors. Because if I told people, if I made it visible, it became something they could comment on, criticize, minimize. My parents had taught me that my achievements were either expected or insignificant. Natalie had taught me that my successes made her uncomfortable, threatened her position as the special one. I had learned to keep my wins quiet, to celebrate privately, to build in shadows. It had become habit. But Daniel wasn't my parents. He wasn't Natalie. He was the person who saw me, really saw me, and loved what he found. So I told him the truth. Because I wanted something that was just mine, I said quietly. Something they couldn't touch or taint or take credit for. Something that existed outside their narrative. He squeezed my hand. "I understand that," he said. "But I'm your husband. I'm on your team. You don't have to hide from me." I felt tears prick my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. "You're right," I said. "I'm sorry. I should have shared more." He shook his head. "Don't apologize. I get why you did it. I just want to make sure you know that whatever you're planning, because I know you're planning something, I'm with you." I blinked back the tears and looked at him. "What makes you think I'm planning something?" He laughed, the sound warm and knowing. "Because I've been married to you for 9 years. I know that look. I know what it means when you go quiet and watchful. You're not sad about the wedding invitation. You're calculating." "So what are you calculating?" I told him. I explained the cancellation clause, the timeline, the financial implications. I walked him through what would happen if the venue exercised its right to cancel. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as the reality of what I was considering settled in. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question I had been asking myself. "Do you really want to do this?" "It's not about wanting," I said. "It's about what's right." They excluded our children from a family wedding. They made a choice that says Sophie and Lucas are less important than aesthetics. That's not something I can overlook or forgive. "But this won't just hurt Natalie," he said gently. "It will hurt your parents too. It will probably end your relationship with them." I had thought about that extensively. The truth was, I wasn't sure we had a relationship to end. We had proximity. We had obligation. We had the performance of family. But relationship implied reciprocity, mutual care, genuine connection. I couldn't remember the last time my parents had asked about my life with real interest. I couldn't remember the last time they had shown up for me without being asked. I couldn't remember the last time they had chosen me over Natalie. Maybe there had been moments when I was very young, before Natalie's personality had fully emerged, before the roles had been assigned. But those moments, if they existed, were so distant they felt like stories someone had told me rather than memories I owned. I looked at Daniel, this man who had given me more love and support in 9 years than my parents had given me in 35. My relationship with them ended a long time ago, I said. I've just been pretending it didn't because pretending was easier than grieving. But I can't pretend anymore. Not when it affects our children. He nodded slowly. Then I support you, he said. Whatever you decide to do, I'm with you. Just promise me you're doing this for the right reasons. Not revenge, but boundaries. I considered his words carefully. Revenge would be acting out of spite, wanting to cause pain for pain's sake. Boundaries were about protecting what mattered, about saying enough, about refusing to participate in my own diminishment. This felt like boundaries. This felt like finally, after decades of accepting crumbs, walking away from a table that was never set for me. The next morning, I called Julian. He was at the venue doing a walkthrough for an upcoming corporate event. When he answered, I could hear the echo of the empty ballroom in the background. "Hey boss," he said cheerfully. "What's up?" "I need to talk to you about a booking," I said. "The Hayes Whitmore wedding in June." He paused. "Your sister's wedding?" I had told my business partners about my family situation when we formed the investment group. Not in exhaustive detail, but enough that they understood the dynamics. Julian knew that Natalie and I weren't close, that my family was complicated, that there was history. But he didn't know about the children being excluded. I filled him in now, keeping my voice level and factual. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. "That's cold," he said. "Banning kids from a family wedding. His own niece and nephew." "Yeah," I said. "So I'm considering exercising the venue's cancellation clause." There was a long silence. "Victoria," he said carefully, "I understand why you're upset. I would be too. But canceling her wedding, that's nuclear." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure that I don't want to facilitate an event that celebrates a family that doesn't value my children," I said. "I'm sure that I don't want to profit from my sister's wedding when she doesn't think my kids are worthy of attending. I'm sure that I'm done being invisible and accommodating." He sighed. "Okay," he said. "I hear you. But we need to think about the business implications. The Whitmores have money and connections. If we cancel, they could make trouble for us. Bad reviews, legal threats, pressure on other clients. We've worked hard to build the reputation we have. I don't want to risk that." He was right to be concerned. I had thought about the potential fallout. The Whitmores were exactly the kind of people who could cause problems if they felt wronged. Gregory Whitmore sat on boards and knew lawyers and had friends in city government. Diane Whitmore was connected to every wealthy family in Portland's social scene. They could absolutely make life difficult for the Riverside estate if they chose to. But I had also thought about leverage. And I had plenty. "Have you seen the guest list for the wedding?" I asked Julian. He confirmed he had. The client had submitted it weeks ago as part of the planning process. "Look at names 15 through 35, I said. "Tell me what you notice." I heard him pull up the file, the sound of papers rustling or a screen being tapped. After a moment, he made a small sound of realization. "These are all people we've worked with," he said. "Board members from nonprofits we've hosted fundraisers for. Executives from companies we've done corporate events with. That gallery owner who books us for exhibition openings." "Exactly," I said. "This wedding isn't just a family event. It's a networking opportunity for the Whitmores. Half the guest list consists of people who have existing relationships with our venue. If we cancel, yes, the Whitmores will be angry. But they'll also have to explain to 40 of their closest connections why the premier venue in Portland decided they didn't want their business. And those connections might wonder what the Whitmores did to burn that bridge." Julian was quiet, processing. "You've thought this through," he said. "I have," I confirmed. "This isn't impulsive. This is strategic. I'm not trying to destroy them. I'm trying to set a boundary that protects my family. And I'm willing to accept the professional consequences if they come. But I don't think they will. I think the Whitmores will quietly find another venue and tell people there was a scheduling conflict or a change of plans. Because making a big deal about it would require explaining the details, and the details don't make them look good. He considered for another long moment. What does Helen think? He asked. And Marcus and Priya? I haven't talked to them yet, I admitted. I wanted to check with you first since you handle all the event coordination. But I will discuss it with everyone before making a final decision. This is a partnership. I won't act unilaterally on something this significant. We need to meet, he said. All of us. Tonight if possible. I agreed and we set a time. That evening, the 5 of us gathered at a quiet restaurant in Northwest Portland, a place we had come to think of as our unofficial headquarters for important discussions. We sat in a back corner booth, away from other diners, and I laid out the situation in full. I showed them the invitation with its conspicuous omission of my children's names. I read them my mother's note about keeping the wedding elegant and adult. I explained the family dynamics, the history of favoritism and dismissal, the pattern that had culminated in this moment. Then I told them what I wanted to do and why. Helen spoke first. She had known me the longest of anyone at the table aside from Daniel's family. She had watched my children grow up, had been to birthday parties and school events, had seen me navigate the delicate balance of building a business while raising a family largely without my parents' involvement. I support you, she said firmly. Family should protect family. If your parents and sister can't see the value of Sophie and Lucas, that's their failure, not yours. And I don't think you should have to host an event that hurts you. Marcus nodded in agreement. He had his own complicated family history, years of rejection and instability before finding his footing. He understood what it meant to be deemed unworthy by people who were supposed to love you. This is your call, he said. But for what it's worth, I think boundaries are healthy. You've spent your whole life accommodating them. Maybe it's time they accommodate you. Priya leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. I'm thinking about this from a business perspective, she said. And I see Julian's concerns about potential backlash. But I also see the strength of our position. We're not the ones being unreasonable here. They are. And if they try to paint us as the bad guys, we have a paper trail that shows we've been nothing but professional. The cancellation clause exists for situations exactly like this. We're within our rights to use it. Plus, she added with a slight smile, I've done some research on Gregory Whitmore. He's currently trying to secure financing for a new development project. He needs to maintain good relationships with the business community. Starting a public feud with a respected venue would be a bad look. He'll want to keep this quiet. Julian was the last to weigh in. He had been watching all of us, listening to the discussion, his fingers drumming lightly on the table in the way they did when he was thinking hard. I'm in, he said finally. But I want to do this smart. We cancel with the full 60 days notice the contract allows. We offer a complete refund of all deposits and any payments made. We provide a list of alternative venues and offer to facilitate the transfer of vendor contacts. We are impeccably professional and courteous. We give them no ammunition to claim we acted in bad faith. I nodded. That's exactly what I was thinking. We do this cleanly. No drama, no explanations beyond the standard language in the cancellation clause. We simply exercise our contractual right and step back. So we're agreed, Helen said, looking around the table. Everyone nodded. Priya reached out and squeezed my hand. You deserve better than how they've treated you, she said. And your kids definitely deserve better. Don't second-guess this. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. These people, my business partners and friends, saw me. They understood. They had my back in a way my family never had. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't face it alone. We set a timeline. The wedding was June 15th. Today was February 20th. That gave us just under 4 months. The 60-day cancellation notice needed to go out by April 15th at the latest. But I wanted to wait a bit longer, let Natalie get deeper into planning, let my parents get more invested in the spectacle. Not to be cruel, but to ensure that when the cancellation came, the message was unmistakable. You excluded my children. There are consequences for that. March passed in a blur of wedding updates and business as usual. Natalie's excitement reached fever pitch as details came together. She posted about her bridal shower, a lavish affair my mother hosted at an upscale restaurant where guests brought gifts from a registry that included items costing hundreds of dollars. She posted about her bachelorette party, a weekend trip to wine country funded by her bridesmaids and my parents. She posted about final dress fittings and honeymoon planning and the custom cocktail menu she had designed for the reception. Each post was a carefully curated image of perfection, filtered and angled and captioned to communicate joy and sophistication and a life well lived. I liked none of them. I commented on none of them. I maintained my silence and my distance. Natalie didn't seem to notice or care. She was too wrapped up in her own narrative to register my absence from the cheering section. My mother called once during this time, asking if I had ordered my dress for the wedding yet. She reminded me that the color scheme was blush and gold, that guests were expected to dress formally, that this was an important event and I should make an effort to look appropriate. I told her I hadn't ordered anything yet. She had sighed with exasperation and said I really needed to prioritize this, that it would reflect poorly on the family if I showed up looking dowdy. I had promised to handle it and ended the call. The irony of being told to prioritize a wedding my children were banned from attending was not lost on me. Sophie asked about the wedding a few times. She had seen Natalie's social media posts on my phone, pictures of flowers and dresses and cake designs. When is Aunt Natalie's wedding? She asked one Saturday morning over pancakes. Soon, I said carefully. Are we going to go? It's going to be a grown-up party, I said, keeping my voice light. Just for adults. Her face fell. Why can't kids come? Sometimes weddings are just for grown-ups, I explained, hating every word. But we'll do something special that same weekend. Maybe we can have our own party. Lucas, who had been more interested in his dinosaur toys than the conversation, looked up. Can we have a dinosaur party? Absolutely, Daniel said, jumping in to redirect. We can have the biggest dinosaur party ever. Cake shaped like a T-Rex and everything. Sophie wasn't fully convinced but she let it drop. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, I stood in the doorway of her room watching her small form curled under blankets covered in stars. She was 8 years old, smart and sensitive and completely unaware that her own grandparents considered her presence at a family event to be a problem to be avoided. I felt rage rise in my throat, hot and bitter. Not the explosive kind of anger that burns out quickly, but the cold kind that settles deep and changes you. My parents were teaching my children that they were conditional. That their value depended on circumstances, on convenience, on not being inconvenient. I would not let that lesson take root. I would protect them from it even if that protection looked like absence, like distance, like burning bridges. April arrived with spring rain and cherry blossoms and the deadline I had set for myself. On April 10th, exactly 66 days before the wedding, I drafted the cancellation notice. Julian had helped me with the wording, making sure it was legally sound and professionally neutral. It referenced the standard cancellation clause, stated that the venue was exercising its right to cancel the Hayes-Whitmore wedding scheduled for June 15th, and offered a full refund of all deposits and payments made to date. It provided contact information for 3 comparable venues and offered to transfer vendor contacts at no charge. It was courteous, brief, and utterly devastating. I read it over a dozen times, looking for any hint of emotion or pettiness. There was none. It was a business communication, clean and professional. I sent it to my partners for final review. Each of them approved. Then I took a deep breath and hit send. The email went out at 10 in the morning on a Thursday. I knew Natalie checked her email obsessively. I knew she would see it within minutes. I set my phone to silent and went about my day, managing property issues and reviewing financial reports, keeping my hands busy and my mind focused. I didn't have to wait long for the reaction. My phone started vibrating at 11:30. I glanced at the screen and saw Natalie's name flashing. I let it go to voicemail. She called again immediately. Voicemail. A third time. Voicemail. Then text messages started flooding in, each one more frantic than the last. Victoria, call me right now. This is an emergency. Why is the venue canceling our wedding? What is happening? Call me. I set the phone face down on my desk and continued working. 20 minutes later, my mother called. I answered on the third ring, keeping my voice neutral and professional. Hello, Mom. Victoria, what is going on? She said without preamble, her voice pitched high with stress. Natalie just called me hysterical. She says the Riverside estate canceled her wedding. Do you know anything about this? Why would I know anything about it? I asked calmly. I don't work for the venue. Because you're her sister, my mother snapped. Because this is a family crisis. Because we need to figure out what happened and fix it. I'm sure they sent an explanation in the cancellation notice, I said. Have you read it? My mother made an exasperated sound. It just says they're exercising some clause in the contract. It doesn't give a real reason. There has to be a mistake. Venues don't just cancel weddings 2 months out for no reason. Maybe you should call them and ask for clarification, I suggested. I'm sure they'll explain their decision. I can't believe you're being so calm about this, my mother said, her voice rising. Your sister is devastated. This is her wedding. Can you at least pretend to care? I do care, I said quietly. I care that my sister planned a wedding she didn't think my children were worthy of attending. I care that you supported that decision. I care that this entire family has made it clear where Sophie and Lucas rank in your priorities. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. What does that have to do with the venue canceling? My mother demanded. Everything, I said. It has everything to do with it. There was a pause, heavy with confusion and dawning suspicion. Victoria, my mother said slowly, her voice dropping to something dangerous. What did you do? I didn't do anything wrong, I said. I simply decided I'm no longer interested in facilitating events that exclude my children. Another pause, longer this time. The venue, she said. You're involved with the venue. I'm one of the owners, I confirmed. Have been for 3 years. The Riverside estate is part of my property investment portfolio. The one you've never asked about because you've never been interested in my life. I heard her breath catch, the sound of information rearranging itself into a picture she didn't want to see. You did this, she said, her voice shaking now with rage rather than confusion. You canceled your sister's wedding out of spite because you're bitter about some childish grudge. It's not spite, I corrected. It's boundaries. You chose to exclude my children from a family wedding. I chose not to host that wedding at my venue. Those are both choices, and both have consequences. You can't do this, my mother said, her voice taking on the commanding tone she used when she expected immediate compliance. You need to undo this right now. Call them back. Tell them it was a mistake. I can't undo it, I said. The cancellation notice has been sent. The contract allows for 60 days notice, which we've provided. All deposits will be refunded in full. I've even provided referrals to other venues. This is being handled professionally and fairly. Fairly, my mother repeated, her voice breaking. You think it's fair to destroy your sister's wedding because you're jealous that she didn't want children running around ruining her special day? I'm not jealous, I said, surprised by how calm my voice remained. I'm tired. I'm tired of being the daughter whose needs don't matter. I'm tired of watching you pour love and money and attention into Natalie while treating me like an afterthought. I'm tired of my children being treated like they're less important than the aesthetic of a party. So I'm done. I'm done participating in the family dynamic that hurts me and hurts them. You're being selfish, my mother spat. You're punishing everyone because you didn't get your way. This is exactly why Natalie didn't want children at the wedding. They turn everything into a drama. Apparently adults do that too, I said. I have to go, Mom. I have work to do. Don't call me again to discuss this. My decision is final. I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking now, adrenaline finally breaking through the calm facade I had maintained. I set the phone down and closed my eyes, breathing slowly until the shaking stopped. I had done it. I had drawn the line. There was no going back now. The rest of the day was chaos I observed from a distance. Natalie called 6 more times. My father called twice. Aunt Linda called. Uncle Thomas called. Cousin Michelle sent a long text message about family loyalty and forgiveness and how I was making a terrible mistake. I responded to none of them. Daniel came home early from work, having sensed something significant was happening. He found me in the backyard, sitting on the porch swing we had installed last summer. He sat beside me and took my hand. You sent it, he said. It wasn't a question. I sent it, I confirmed. And they're losing their minds. He nodded. How do you feel? I thought about that. How did I feel? Scared, certainly. I had just detonated a bomb in the center of my family and the fallout would be extensive and lasting. Sad, because even though I knew this was necessary, it still hurt to sever connections that had once meant something, even if that something was mostly obligation and hope. But underneath the fear and sadness was something else. Relief. A sense of lightness I hadn't expected. For 35 years I had carried the weight of trying to be enough, trying to earn love that should have been given freely, trying to fit into a space that had never been designed to hold me. I had just set that weight down. I had just stopped trying. And the freedom of that, even in the midst of crisis, was extraordinary. I feel like I can breathe, I told Daniel. For the first time in my life, I feel like I can actually breathe. He pulled me close, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. I'm proud of you, he said quietly. I know this wasn't easy. Thank you for believing in me, I said. Thank you for being the family I needed when mine couldn't be. We sat together as the sun set, watching the sky turn pink and orange and purple, and I let myself feel everything. The grief and the relief and the certainty that I had done the right thing. The next morning brought a new wave of attacks. My phone was full of voicemails I didn't listen to and text messages I skimmed but didn't read in detail. The family group chat had exploded overnight, messages flying back and forth about the situation. I had been removed from the chat at some point, excommunicated digitally, but Daniel's mother Joyce had been included in some of the correspondence and she forwarded me screenshots. The messages were what I expected. Natalie was painted as the victim, devastated and betrayed. I was painted as vindictive and cruel, letting a small slight turn into nuclear retaliation. My mother had sent a long message about how disappointed she was in me, how I was throwing away family over nothing, how I would regret this for the rest of my life. What struck me most was not the content of the messages but the absence of any acknowledgement of why I had done what I did. No one mentioned the exclusion of my children. No one questioned whether that decision had been hurtful or wrong. No one suggested that maybe, possibly, they bore some responsibility for the current situation. It was all about my overreaction, my cruelty, my failure to be reasonable. The narrative had been set and I was the villain. I found I didn't care as much as I thought I would. Their narrative had never included the truth about me anyway. This was just one more distortion in a lifetime of distortions. Helen called mid-morning to check in. She had received an angry voicemail from Brandon Whitmore threatening legal action if we didn't reverse the cancellation. She sounded worried but not panicked. I told her I would handle it and called our lawyer, a sharp woman named Catherine who had handled all our business contracts and disputes. I explained the situation, sent her copies of the venue contract and the cancellation notice, and asked her opinion on our legal exposure. She called me back within an hour. You're completely in the clear, she said. The cancellation clause is ironclad. You provided more than the required notice. You're offering a full refund. They have no grounds for legal action. If they try to sue, we'll get it dismissed immediately and we might even be able to countersue for frivolous litigation. Tell your partners to stop worrying. I felt tension I hadn't realized I was holding release from my shoulders. Thank you, Catherine. She paused. Can I ask you something off the record? Of course. Is this really about a contractual decision or is this personal? Both, I admitted. The situation that led to the cancellation is deeply personal. But the decision to cancel was a business decision made by all the partners. We don't want to host events that conflict with our values. And one of our values is protecting family, especially children. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good for you. I've seen your family dynamic at a few events over the years. I've always thought you deserved better." "I appreciate that," I said. "It means more than you know." By afternoon, the second wave hit. Brandon, Natalie's fiancé, called me directly. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to hear what he had to say, whether he would be reasonable or if he would follow the script my family was already performing. I answered with a neutral greeting. "Victoria," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We need to talk about this situation." "I'm listening," I said. "This cancellation is unacceptable," he continued. "My family has invested significant resources into planning this wedding. We've made commitments to vendors, sent invitations to important people, arranged travel for family coming from out of state. Your personal issues with your sister cannot be allowed to disrupt all of that." "My personal issues," I repeated. "Is that what you think this is about?" "What else would it be about?" he shot back. "Natalie told me you're upset that children weren't invited. That's not a legitimate reason to cancel a wedding venue. It's petty and vindictive." "Did she tell you the children in question are my son and daughter?" I asked. "Her niece and nephew. Your future niece and nephew." "Did she mention that part?" He hesitated. "She said it was a family issue." "It is a family issue," I agreed. "The issue is that your fiancé and my parents decided my children aren't important enough to be included in a family celebration. That's the issue. Not my reaction to it, but the decision that prompted it." "Look," he said, his tone shifting slightly towards something that might have been meant to sound conciliatory but landed as condescending. "I understand you're hurt. But weddings are stressful and expensive. Decisions have to be made. It wasn't personal." "Not personal," I said. "Banning specific children from a family wedding isn't personal." "I see. What would you call it then?" "Practical," he said. "The venue has white carpets and glass walls. The whole aesthetic would be ruined by sticky fingers and spills. It was about preserving the elegance of the event." "The venue you're talking about is my venue," I said. "I own it. I built it. Those white carpets and glass walls are mine. And I've hosted hundreds of events there, including many with children in attendance. The aesthetic has never been ruined because we know how to plan appropriately. This wasn't about practicality. This was about your fiancé not wanting to share attention with anyone who might detract from her being the center of focus. And my parents enabled that selfishness because they always have." Brandon was silent for several beats. Then he said, his voice harder now, "My father is a very influential man in this city. If you insist on maintaining this cancellation, there will be consequences for your business." "Is that a threat?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "It's a reality," he said. "My family has connections throughout Portland's business community. We can make things very difficult for the Riverside estate if we choose to." "I'm sure you can try," I said. "But I suggest you think carefully before you do. Half your wedding guest list consists of people who have existing relationships with my venue. If you start a public conflict, you'll have to explain why we chose to cancel. And that explanation includes the detail about excluding young children from a family wedding. I'm not sure that's a story that makes your family look good to the nonprofit board members and business executives you're trying to impress." He sputtered, clearly not expecting me to push back. "You're making a huge mistake," he finally managed. The only mistake I made was waiting this long to set boundaries, I replied. The cancellation stands. All deposits will be refunded within 10 business days. I've provided referrals to 3 other venues that have similar availability. I suggest you start making calls. I hung up before he could respond. My heart was pounding, but I felt oddly exhilarated. I had just stood up to a man who expected his family's money and connections to intimidate me into compliance. I had just refused to back down. It felt powerful in a way I hadn't anticipated. That evening, my father showed up at my house. Daniel answered the door and I heard their voices in the entryway, my father's gruff tone and Daniel's careful responses. I walked out to find them standing in an awkward standoff, my father looking older than I remembered, his face drawn and tired. Victoria, he said when he saw me. We need to talk. We can talk out here, I said, not inviting him further inside. I didn't want him in my home, in the space I had built that was separate from their toxicity. Daniel gave my hand a quick squeeze and retreated, giving us privacy but staying close enough to intervene if needed. My father looked at me for a long moment. I don't understand why you're doing this, he said finally. She's your sister. She's also someone who thinks my children are less important than her color scheme, I replied. Do you not see how that's a problem? He sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. Kids can be disruptive at weddings. It's not uncommon to have adult-only events. You're taking this too personally. I'm taking it exactly as personally as it is, I said. This is my family. These are my children. When you exclude them, you're excluding me. You're telling me that my family doesn't matter to this family. He shook his head. That's not what anyone is saying. We want you there. That's why you were invited. Just me, I pointed out. Not my husband who has been part of this family for 9 years. Not my children who are your grandchildren. Just me, alone, expected to smile and celebrate while being reminded that the people I love most in this world aren't welcome. And you don't see anything wrong with that? Your mother and I have tried to be good parents to both of you, he said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. We've supported you. We've been there for you. Have you? I asked quietly. Have you really? Because I remember a lot of times when I needed support and you weren't there. I remember saving for college on my own while you paid for Natalie's education. I remember building a business without any help from you while you co-signed loans for her condos. I remember every birthday party and school event you missed because Natalie had something more important happening. I remember being invisible in this family for as long as I can remember. His face flushed. We did the best we could. Natalie needed more help. She's always been more, he paused, searching for words, more delicate. You were always so capable. You didn't need us the same way. That's what you tell yourself, I said. That I didn't need you. But the truth is you didn't want to see that I did need you. It was easier to focus on Natalie because she demanded attention and I didn't. But not demanding attention doesn't mean I didn't deserve it. It just means I learned early on that asking would only lead to disappointment. So I stopped asking. And you never noticed. He looked away, uncomfortable with the truth hanging between us. What do you want from me? He asked. An apology? Fine. I'm sorry you felt neglected. Now will you reconsider the venue cancellation? No, I said. Because this isn't about apologies. This is about actions and choices and patterns that have played out for 35 years. This is about my children learning that they have value regardless of what their grandparents think. This is about me finally choosing myself and my family over the family that never chose me. You're being stubborn, he said, anger creeping into his voice now. You're blowing up your sister's wedding over hurt feelings. Over some perceived slight that happened years ago. It's not one slight, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. It's a lifetime of slights. It's every time you chose her over me. Every time you dismissed my achievements. Every time you treated my needs as optional while treating hers as urgent. It's every missed event and every forgotten birthday and every time you made me feel like I was a burden instead of a daughter. And now it's my children being treated the same way I was treated. And I won't allow it." He stared at me, and for just a moment I thought I saw something like recognition in his eyes, a flicker of understanding. But then it was gone, replaced by frustration and anger. "You're going to regret this," he said. "You're destroying this family over nothing." "I'm not destroying anything," I replied. "I'm just refusing to keep building bridges to people who keep burning them. There's a difference." He turned and walked back to his car without another word. I stood on the porch and watched him drive away, my body shaking with the aftermath of confrontation. Daniel appeared beside me, wrapping me in his arms. "You did good," he murmured into my hair. "That was hard and you did it anyway. I'm proud of you." I leaned into him, letting his warmth and steadiness anchor me. "Is it always going to feel this bad?" I asked. "Doing the right thing but knowing it's causing pain?" He considered. "Maybe for a while," he said. "But eventually the pain of holding boundaries will hurt less than the pain of not having them. You're protecting our kids. You're protecting yourself. That's never the wrong choice even when it's the hard one." The following weeks unfolded with a strange mixture of chaos and clarity. Natalie found another venue, a country club with less prestige but adequate space. The wedding was rescheduled for 3 weeks later than originally planned, pushing it into early July. My mother sent one final text informing me that I was no longer welcome at the wedding or any family gatherings going forward. I didn't respond. The silence from my end seemed to infuriate them more than any argument would have. My business partners rallied around me. Helen brought coffee and sat with me on particularly difficult days. Marcus handled property issues that would normally require my attention, giving me space to process. Priya sent articles about family estrangement and healing, resources I appreciated even if I wasn't ready to read them yet. Julian reported that the Whitmores had made some half-hearted attempts to badmouth the venue to mutual contacts, but the efforts had backfired. People asked questions, and the answers revealed more about the Whitmores than about us. Sophie and Lucas remained blissfully unaware of most of the drama. We told them that Aunt Natalie's wedding had changed and we wouldn't be going anymore, but we were still having our dinosaur party. Lucas was thrilled. Sophie asked once if Aunt Natalie was mad at us. I told her the truth in language she could understand. "Sometimes grown-ups disagree about important things," I said. "And sometimes that means we don't spend as much time together. But that's okay. We have lots of people who love us." She had accepted that and moved on, her resilience a reminder of why I had done what I did. June 15th arrived, the day that would have been the wedding at my venue. Instead, I spent it at the coast with Daniel and the kids. We built sandcastles and flew kites and ate ice cream that dripped down our chins in the summer heat. That evening, as the sun set over the Pacific, I received a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of Natalie and Brandon at their rescheduled wedding, surrounded by guests in formal attire. The caption read, "She got her perfect day anyway. You accomplished nothing." I looked at the photo for a long moment, studying my sister's smile, the elegant decorations, the crowd of well-dressed people. Then I looked at my own children, sandy and sunburned and laughing as they chased waves. I deleted the message without responding. 3 months later, I received an unexpected email. It was from Aunt Linda, the first communication I had received from any family member since the cancellation. She wrote that she had been thinking about everything that happened, that she had started to see patterns she hadn't noticed before. She wrote that she was sorry for not speaking up when my children were excluded, that she should have questioned the decision instead of going along with it. She wrote that she would like to have coffee sometime, if I was open to it. No pressure, no expectations, just an offer. I met her at Copper Moon Cafe on a rainy Saturday morning in October. She looked nervous, clutching her coffee cup with both hands. We talked for 2 hours. She asked about my business, really asked, wanting to understand what I had built. She asked about Sophie and Lucas, their interests and personalities. She apologized, not with excuses but with genuine remorse for the ways she had participated in family dynamics that hurt me. She didn't ask me to reconcile with my parents or Natalie. She just said she wanted to do better, to be present in my life if I would allow it. I told her I would think about it. Over the following months, she proved consistent. She showed up at Sophie's school play. She sent Lucas a book about dinosaurs for his birthday. She called to check in, not to gossip about family drama but to actually connect. Slowly, carefully, I allowed her back into my life. Not all the way, not yet, but enough to see if something real could be built. My parents never reached out. Natalie never apologized. The family fractured along predictable lines, with most people siding with the narrative that I had overreacted. I grieved that loss, the final death of hope that they might someday see me clearly. But I also found unexpected freedom in it. I stopped performing for an audience that would never applaud. I stopped seeking approval from people who had never learned how to give it. The Riverside estate continued to thrive. We booked weddings and galas and celebrations for families who valued connection over aesthetics. My property portfolio grew. My children grew, surrounded by people who showed up for them consistently and unconditionally. Daniel and I grew stronger, our partnership deepened by weathering the storm together. I built a life that was mine, not in reaction to what my family had denied me, but in response to what I discovered I could create. On a cold evening in December, I stood in my office overlooking the city, watching lights twinkle against the dark sky. My phone buzzed with a message from Helen about a new property opportunity. Behind me, framed photos lined the walls. My children at various ages, Daniel and me on our wedding day, my business partners at our 5-year anniversary celebration. My in-laws at a family barbecue. People who had chosen me, and whom I had chosen in return. I thought about that wedding invitation that had arrived 18 months earlier, the one that had cracked something open inside me. I thought about the girl I had been, always trying to earn love that should have been freely given. I thought about the woman I had become, someone who finally understood that belonging doesn't require permission from people who refuse to see your worth. I had walked away from a table where I was never truly welcome. And in doing so, I had found my way to a feast I had built myself, surrounded by people who celebrated my presence rather than tolerated it. That was the victory. Not in the cancellation or the confrontation, but in the choice to finally, completely, choose myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.